Thank you very much for your responses and the non-diplomatic responses and language as well, which I think is important. I think the fact that you spoke to questions of representation, each of you, that you spoke to questions of inclusion, that you spoke about breaking out of these systems, right? These values that are instilled through education, through disciplining by parents, et cetera, et cetera. It's a boy, right? It's okay that he's doing something, et cetera. To sort of speaking about contextualizing, right, both on a regional sphere, on a local sphere, and as a historical perspective, and really sort of offering us ways of thinking about this intersection of gender and democracy, right, based on both your personal and professional experiences. I think I'd like to follow up with a few questions to each of you quickly that touch on some of these things that you've already mentioned, hoping to give you a little bit more room to elaborate, right, for a few minutes, and maybe also speak to what each other has said, and also elaborate maybe how this relates to the project. And I think I'll go in opposite now, and I'll start with Ambassador Weiss and sort of ask you, what kind of differences do you see on the international sphere, or more recently your experience in the States in particular versus in Europe when it comes to questions of gender equality? Do you think that there's something we can take away from this international context to apply to the local context? Rachel spoke to these different sort of scales of interaction, right, including the transnational. And as head of Salzburg Global Seminar, you spoke a little bit to some of the fantastic work that you're doing in sort of shaping how future leaders, current leaders think. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to how do you see education transformation sort of contributing to gender equality and to some of these issues that we've been speaking to, because you have sort of direct contact with these individuals. So please go ahead.
Well, it's a good question, and I thought about that. Gender equality, United States, Europe, Austria, where are the differences? Are there huge differences? And first I wanted to say, yes, it's really different. And then when I looked at it, I thought, actually, it's not that different. Because if you look at politics, women are underrepresented in the United States. They're underrepresented in Austria. Just look at the numbers of all of our elected bodies. When you look at the pay gap, well, there's a pay gap in the United States, there's a pay gap in Austria. So at the end of the day, I think if you look at all the parameters, the differences are not that huge. I mean, there are some differences. I think there are now in the United States more women in college than men, so there are some changes. But by and large, I don't think that the challenges have really changed all that much. I think this really goes transboundary. What I found different in my last years in the United States, this issue of backlash, that I found different. I could never have thought that the question of abortion would become such a political fighting ground. In Austria, I don't think that any political party tries to make headways by fighting the right to abortion. Not even the right. I don't even. They would fight it if it would help them, but apparently it doesn't help them, so they don't. But I don't. In the United States, I see this much sharper debate, like this discussion on critical race theory, which again, like the gender issue, those are not crazy ideas. That the world in the U.S. is geared still against black people. I mean, it's like obvious, right? Just look at the numbers. Look at who gets credits in a bank, who doesn't, and then you can go down the list. It's quite obvious. But the backlash against these kind of truths really is humongous. I mean, presidential candidates make a career out of taking this up. I mean, they have laws in 17 states that fight against these kind of theories. Books are being banned in schools, and I'm like, whoa. So for me, I see the harshness of this debate, this backlash, and I don't see it in that level in Austria. Maybe I don't see it, but I haven't seen political headwinds that someone really takes this up. I mean, they might make these arguments in some councils, but I haven't seen it as a strong political movement that really now says, okay, now we're gonna fight back, and women back into the kitchen and da. You'll find some people who say it, but I haven't seen it as so. In that sense, I found this harshness of the backlash and how much political campaigning is really happening. I think in Fox News the other day they had the number that they had talked about critical race theory in 2020. I think it came up 15 times in the program in a month. This month it came up 972 times. So it's like completely out of control discussion. So that I found quite interesting. On education, you know, we do a number of programs in Salzburg Global on education because at the end of the day, education totally goes towards the argument of inclusion, right? Our education systems fail so many people on so many levels. And without the right education, it will filter down into participation, and it will filter down into basically who runs your country and who doesn't. So I think we try at Salzburg Global to approach it with an open visor and to really empower, include, strengthen on all the levels that we can. Because at the end of the day, it's very selfish. We will be a much more successful society if we get it right. That's actually quite simple, I think. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate sort of turning that around in the way that Schwarzenegger does by speaking about pollution, by also sort of saying, well, this is also selfish. The world will be a better place if we get there, right? If we move towards this gender equality. So thank you for your perspective. I'll move on to Dr. Veits-Falk. I really like this your comment that it's not seamless, right? Yeah. And this sort of speaking about the historical aspects, right? And I was wondering if you could maybe add a few reflections on this sort of historical development of gender activism and particularly this visibility of women in the Austrian context, right? I think that's a really particularly interesting aspect to think about. As you know, we have an increase of visibility of women in politics, right? But what does this look like, and how do we see these trends?
Yeah, again, if we take the historical perspective, first gender activism dates back to the 19th century, to the first women's movement. In Austria, the women's movement, as for example, even also in Germany, developed in the from a background depending on different political ideas. We had, for example, a moderate bourgeois women's movement, a radical women's movement, and even a proletarian or social democratic movement. And all these women took different forms, different activities to show, because to demand, to take out, to show what they wanted, which demands they had. For example, bourgeois women wrote petitions to the parliament at home, and proletarian women wrote banners and went in the streets to claim their demands. A very important role from the beginning on plays education, because there was higher education, or let's say education better than basic education, qualified training and employment are closely related to each other, and it took until the 1870s that women could, for example, could be apprentices, and because a very long time, at least by the end of the 19th century, and even until the middle of the 20th century, education and higher qualification was a male privilege. And therefore, women went on the streets and demonstrated with different forms. This would be an example for the old women's movement. And if we have a look, for example, at the new women's movement, here women took, there were mottos like, or keywords like, the private is political, and, or abortion was such a topic all over the world, we could say, even or at least where women activities took place, and here, especially in Austria, it took until the 1970s and 1980s until women became visible in public. That is to say, it took until the 1980s that women were represented more, that there was a percentage of more than 20% that women were represented in political bodies. So it took a long time, and here again, always dependent on the political situation. And what is important for me, and I would say, is that we still should make achievements of women visible. We still need role models, and it's not only making women visible, but it is also keeping them visible. Not only to, for example, with one event or celebrating the Women's Day on the 8th of March, but it must be a process of keeping visible, and this I think is a very important point.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I think taking into account these sort of historical perspectives, and I think the way that you highlight that there's always a spectrum of activism, right? That I think one of the questions earlier to Rachel also sort of spoke to is important to consider, because, you know, there's lessons to be learned on both what has worked in the past or what has worked over time, right? But also what has had maybe negative repercussions or what maybe hasn't worked, so that we can potentially improve on it. And I think it sort of also echoes some of your comments, what Rachel was speaking to, this question of sustaining, right? Sustaining the sustainability, right? Not just trying to think about, okay, sustainability as such in terms of representation or activism, but also thinking about it as a verb, right? The continued act of doing. So thank you for that. And I think sort of keeping that in mind, I think Councillor Schiester, you would be considered this sort of new generation of politician, right, to some degree. And I think in politics these days, there is some narratives that speak to, you know, gender is not is now to some degree irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter. Women are getting elected to politics all the time. We have women being represented. And I'm just wondering, would you agree to this? How do you see it? And if you don't agree, I'd be interested to know to some degree also, when do you see sort of gender becoming salient in day-to-day politics, and are there times at which it actually is irrelevant? And I think that's a really interesting aspect to maybe have you reflect on.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Maybe I want to start because Sabine Veits-Falk was talking about role models, and maybe some of you have seen this video clip about Sanna Marin and Jacinda Ardern talking to journalists when they met, and those prime ministers of Finland and New Zealand. And some journalists asked them, "Oh, so now you're meeting, you two women, because you're female and like the same age?" And they were saying, "No, because we're prime ministers." And I was like, "Yeah, this is." So I can answer the question you asked me with, it still plays a role. So if you look into the international context or the local context, it always plays a role. So even when Jacinda Ardern, I think she stepped back 2 or 3 weeks ago, and then there were discussions, well, is it because she has children and she couldn't take her role as a mother seriously, and maybe she would have needed someone to take care of her kids. Maybe this was too much of a burden. I was thinking, like, maybe the kids have a father.
What a novel idea.
Yeah, because no one ever asked who is taking care of Justin Trudeau's kids or so. And then Sebastian Kurz, our former chancellor, he became a father, and he was stepping back to have more time for his wife and child. But somehow he was in the middle of a corruption scandal and took his family as an excuse, but whatever. So whatever you do, if you don't have plans, you're getting asked, you're into family planning. I was asked that several times before I came in, or while I was coming into office. When you're pregnant, you get asked, well, how do you want to manage? And when you are in office, so you're the raven mother or something, so whatever you do as a woman in politics, you do it wrong. So I came into my office 3 months ago, and I was thinking about, so sometimes I'm optimistic. I think everything will be fine, and media will report seriously, and I was looking into the newspaper like, okay, there's this one young woman. Well, does she have experience enough? Maybe she's too emotional. Then they wrote about how I dress up, and I was like, oh, come on. I'm 34, and like our former chancellor, he was even younger when he came into office, and I was thinking, maybe it's the age, but then I thought, no, it's the gender. So to make it short, I think it still plays a role. There's lots of stereotypes still. You have to face, and I always think you have to be stronger and put more effort into everything. So I think it's not any different than the university, maybe, or so.
I have no idea what you're
Okay, yeah, I thought so. So I think, it got better, but we're not where I want to be. So now I'm leading an office with 650 workers in administration. Most of them are men, because it's the construction administration. So it's not easy every day. So they take me serious. But it's interesting to be their boss and have to say sometimes. So lots of funny experiences at the moment for me. And yes, I think we have a long way to go, and because what you said before, I think it takes a lot of solidarity in politics also, over parties, because we can't do it alone on our own. We don't have to not every woman should make the same experiences, and I think there's a long way to become better, but we are here to fight for this.
Thank you. Thank you for your very honest reflection. I hope this was a better day of the days that you were speaking about, days being bad or worse in terms of days in politics.
It's not that bad. I gave every woman courage to do this.
But I found it interesting. We've been speaking a little bit throughout tonight on questions of language and the way that you were almost apologetic about managing 650 people, right? Your voice changed when you said that. Your tone changed when you said it. It sounded almost apologetic. And I feel like I would encourage you to bring the anger that you brought to the rest of, maybe not anger, authority, whatever word we need to use that's masculine enough, to your day-to-day job, managing the 650 individuals in construction. I also say this as the daughter of an architect who spent a lot of her life with individuals in construction, so yeah. Language is important, tone is as well, sad to say. But I think it also speaks to this privilege of working in politics and privilege of sort of being somebody who's representing that I think is really lovely to hear from you. Minister Klambauer, you have had an international and sort of prominent career in both business and politics and have spent more time in both. And I'm wondering, sort of looking back, not on the sort of very historical perspective, but on your personal perspective, have you experienced backlash to gender equality over time? Are there signs you feel like you ignored or perhaps you don't even see it this way, or perhaps now when you reflect back on certain aspects of your career, you sort of thought, okay, I ignored something, I should have paid more attention to it, or, you know, sort of ways of that maybe were dismissed in the past that now that are coming to fruition, sort of, if you could reflect on that a little bit. Thank you.
When we look into the international audience here, I think there is a lot of intercultural competence here, so I can only share my own experience, because I think one of the benefits of going abroad is really that it's eye-opening towards your own culture, because when you grow up, of course, your own culture that's just experienced as normal, and once you live abroad and you get to know different cultures, suddenly you realize, you have a new perspective on your own culture. So for me, my first experience abroad was, as for many, being an au pair and growing up in a family with a stay-at-home mom, suddenly living in a family of with two parents, both working full-time, career, TV jobs, and it was for me really eye-opening, because for the first time I realized how conservative Austria and our role models really were at that time. And later on, I moved to China for almost 3 years, and I was really impressed. I was working in IT, that there were as many women as men in those engineering jobs, because we know it from the communist countries. In Europe, of course, there is no difference in which field they are working in. So there are lots of women working as engineers. I thought, oh, that's really great. But on the other hand, of course, there's also all the disadvantages there. Once they became parents, the mothers really were pushed back into full-time jobs within weeks, which was also, of course, very hard. They had to be married. I really was, I couldn't believe it, that it was not possible to get a child without being married. So they had to look for someone who marries, if it was not the father of the child. So, all those experiences really made me a liberal, where I thought, okay, it should not be culture and it should not be society defining the role models, but we should make it possible that individuals decide about the way they want to live in and how they want to, which job they want to take and how they want to live an equal life, for example. And I mean, for me, it was then later on that we really founded a party, because I really didn't find a party in Austria where I really could find this liberal way of thinking. So I couldn't say that I didn't see the signs, but really this hands-on, just that we can build it together if we want to.
To our speakers for the thoughtful responses. I think you all touched on questions of intersectionality, you touched on questions of gender, democracy, the interplay thereof, this democratic backsliding, whether it's historic or whether it's in a comparative perspective, etc. So I want to just thank you. I think you've given us lots of food for thought as we move forward with the project in the coming years. And I look forward to having further exchanges, and thank you for being here today. I think we have maybe a little bit of time for a couple of questions, in case there are questions from the audience to use at this time to ask our lovely panelists. So I guess I would open up the floor to those questions at this point. I've spoken enough for you to now think of a question, so please do ask it. Go ahead.